Welcome to the Museum of Cherokee in South Carolina. We're the only Native American museum in South Carolina, and our focus is on the Cherokee who lived here for hundreds of years and still live here. There were 27 known Cherokee villages in what is now Oconee County. In fact, our county, Oconee, was named for one of those villages. We're the only county in South Carolina to be named after a Native American town instead of a white settlement. All the rivers in our county were named after the Cherokee villages on those rivers, such as Chattooga, Chauga, Tugelo, Jocassee, Toxaway, Kiwi, and Seneca. This is what a typical Cherokee village would have looked like back in the day. Most of them were on major rivers. This one would be what Kiwi Town probably would have looked like. Every village, they had a council house. Now the thing about the Cherokee, they were a democracy. Most of the southeastern tribes were democracies where they elected their leaders. So they had a council house, which would be the main structure in the village, where all the people in the village could come and make decisions about what to do. There was also a central plaza where they had their games and ceremonies. Each family or each clan had two houses in the same village. They had a winter house and they had a summer house. So in the winter, they could stay in a winter house and build a fire on the floor, but in the summer, it gets really hot around here. So they had an open structure to live in during the summer. So these long buildings would be their summer dwellings. They also had storage buildings around. These little cone-shaped buildings over to the side is where they kept their corn. They also had individual gardens in the village itself, so each family could tend their own garden. But they also had hundreds of acres of corn, beans, and squash outside the village. So the reason they built on the rivers is there was good soil along there. Plus they had transportation up and down the rivers. These displays here, the baskets and the pottery, typical Cherokee style pottery. So that's what you would find if you went into a village back in the day. Our culture here, where we live in the southeastern part of the United States, is very similar to what the Native Americans had back in the day. In fact, we get a lot of what we do here in the South from the natives who lived here. An example would be grits. They grew corn and made lots of different meals out of corn. So they had grits. This is an example made back in the 1590s of Native Americans in South Carolina making grits. Another thing they had was barbecue. Here in South Carolina, we love barbecue. And this image here was made along the coast of South Carolina back in the 1590s of Native Americans making barbecue. So again, a lot of our culture comes from that. Some of the games that we play came from Native American games, like the game of lacrosse. The Cherokee call it stickball. A French missionary who watched one of the games, and before the games they cross their stickball sticks, and he says, "Oh, lacrosse, the cross." So that's the name that stuck. Jerry Wolf, a good friend of ours, made a set of stickball sticks for us here. Everything we have here in the museum has been donated. All the southeastern Indians had a matrilineal society where the women controlled everything. They owned the houses they lived in, the fields that they worked. They owned the children that they had. The daddy of those children could not raise his own children. An illustration of that was this image of some Creek Indians. The older gentleman is Tomochache, and the younger fella is his nephew, Tunahawe. The uncle is raising his nephew because they were in the same clan. Early on, there was a dynamic fur trade between the settlers and the Native Americans. Back in Europe, they didn't have access to furs and skins like we had here in America, so there's a big deerskin trade. So the Cherokees and other natives would trade deer skins for items that they could not manufacture, such as steel implements or hunting implements like this musket. Another thing we get from Native Americans is terminology. They would trade buckskins for muskets. So the English on their list of trade goods would have the price as bucks. So we get our term bucks from buckskins that went on in the fur trade. We've been involved in a number of archaeological digs around in the county. Here's one from Chattooga Town, where they actually excavated the townhouse at Chattooga Town and found a lot of interesting things there. Another one was Oconee Town. that we were involved in early on. We did 2 digs at Oconee Town and found some really fascinating items there. This is a part of the ceremonial pole that they had in the middle of the village. Another item that was donated is this effigy, which would have been like a religious item, and this was found on Toxaway Creek. We're entering the main gallery of the museum now. We have a passageway here, and we use that to honor Jerry Wolfe. A little background on Jerry: he was in World War II, and he piloted landing craft during D-Day. And after his service in the Navy, he came back to Cherokee and was a stonemason. He also took part in a lot of ceremonies. He was eventually named the Beloved Man of the Cherokee, and he was the only one since 1803 to be honored in that way. So he was the most important Cherokee there is. And he was also awarded an honorary doctorate from Western Carolina. He helped design the Oconee County seal using Cherokee symbolism in the design, and also the Oconee County flag. He gave some of the first donations to our museum. He made a set of stickball sticks just for us. And then he came to the Oconee Town acquisition celebration, which was his last public appearance. He passed away shortly after that, so his family came here to cut the ribbon to our gallery that was named in his honor. We're in the gallery now, and what we have is a timeline here starting at the earliest times of Native Americans in America. There are different theories about how they got here. They migrated over from Asia across a land bridge, pretty much where Alaska is now, and then spread out in North America and then South America. But there are conflicting views about that. There's recent research that shows that Native Americans were on the East Coast before they were on the West Coast, and they were also in South America before they were in North America. So this is some new information coming out according to archaeological research. The earliest people who came here had to hunt for their food, and so they would hunt the larger animals that were here at the time. All they had to hunt with was a spear with a large point on it, and they would either throw it a short distance or use it for stabbing the animal. We have illustrations of spear points here and what they could do with it. The next period is the Archaic period, and in this period they developed better weapons or hunting material. They improved the spear by adding a throwing stick to it called an atlatl, so they could use the atlatl to help throw the spear, and it would go twice as far as you could throw it by hand. It had a detachable point, so you could use the point and keep the shaft. They started living in villages back in the Archaic time, and this is a scene that would have been typical along the Savannah River watershed, where they had a fish weir where they could catch fish in the river and cook those fish, and they also hunted, and they had crude shelters to live in. We have some cooking stones here that they used to heat up their food in the fire. So they would get the cooking stones, which were made out of soapstone, put it in the fire, heat it up, take it out, and either put it in a bowl or put it in a depression in the ground. It was lined with leather, and they could cook their food that way. We're fortunate to have one complete cooking stone. So the way they would use that, put it in the fire, and when it got hot enough, stick a stick in the hole, lift it out, and put it in a bowl, and bring that bowl to a boil. We're moving on to the Woodland period now, and in this case they were firmly established in villages, and they also had to put palisades around the villages to protect the villages from animals or other tribes coming into their territory. They were growing most of their food. They also had trade networks set up in other areas of the country, and we have a really good illustration here of a headman buried with seashells. Now here we are up in the mountains of South Carolina and North Carolina where the Cherokee lived, but they had seashells up here. How did they get here? There was a trading path from here down to the coast of South Carolina, and that trading path had been here for thousands of years. Seashells were a hot commodity. They also developed pottery during this time, and we have illustrations of some of the pots that were made thousands of years ago. During the Woodland period, the bow and arrow was developed. So here's an example of a bow that they would have used, and this was a fishing bow. They had longer arrows for that so they could stick the arrow in the water, line it up with the fish, and actually hit the fish. Technology did change over the years, and so this was their final technological improvement before the white man came. The last period we had before the white man came would be the Mississippian period, and it's called Mississippian because there was a common culture throughout the Mississippi drainage area from the Mississippi over to the East Coast. Here's an illustration of a Carolina warrior. It was painted by John White in 1585, and it shows him with his bow. This is how big the bow would have been, 6 feet long. They used that for hunting and warfare. They also used blowguns. This was donated by Jerry Wolfe. It was his personal blowgun, but they used that for small game. It was not for warfare, it was just to hunt game. During this time, Europeans came into America, and it was devastating for the Native Americans. The Europeans brought diseases that the Native Americans had no immunity to. It ended the Mississippian period. This picture is of a child who had smallpox. It was on the outside of your skin, and it's on the inside your nostrils, inside your mouth, inside your ears. 90% of the native population died from European diseases. So after that, it was easy to colonize the Americas after the Europeans came. Towards the end of the Mississippian period, European powers tried to get Native Americans as their allies. We had the French and English and the Spanish trying to get alliances with Native Americans. The English succeeded with the Cherokee because they were closer to where the Cherokee villages were, but we also had to worry about the French. The royal governor of Louisiana, Louis de Kerouac, invited a Cherokee down to New Orleans to sign treaties, made him a captain. The French army gave him a lot of gifts and all, but he took all the gifts and everything, but they didn't make an alliance. They stayed loyal to the British. Now the Cherokees were here in the upstate. The British were mostly along the coast. One of the royal governors of South Carolina, Sir Francis Nicholson, he was so impressed with the Cherokee and their culture that the only memento he took back to England was a Cherokee double weave basket. After he passed on, the basket went to the British Museum, and it's there today. We have other illustrations of Cherokee work here. We have another basket, and then we have evidence of trade here. There was a trading post at Eastatoe. James Beamer was a trader there. This illustration shows the cabin where he was, and we have the lock from that cabin. We have a match coat here. It's similar to what the British would give the headmen as a sign of loyalty or importance, or how important these headmen were to the British. They also gave them gorgets to show that they were recognized by the British as important men, and they could sign treaties and whatnot with them. On our South Carolina flag, what some people call the Carolina moon on our flag is actually a gorget. Now we're moving into the period where the British were in control here in South Carolina and Oconee County. So they were allies with the Cherokee, or the Cherokee were allies with the British. British mistreated the Cherokee in the French and Indian War, so the Cherokee turned against the British, but did not fight for the French. Here's a map of one of the expeditions against the Cherokee. There were two expeditions. There was a Montgomery expedition. When Montgomery came in with his troops, he only used British regulars, and he was soundly defeated by the Cherokee. So he had to skedaddle and went back to Charleston and gave up. But one of his subordinates, Colonel Grant, had an expedition the next year, but he had enough sense to take South Carolina men with him. So all our patriots in South Carolina served with the British during the French and Indian War, and they learned the tactics of the Cherokee, and then they used those against the British later on. During that expedition, they encamped at Oconee town. So we have a lot of evidence of that encampment there. We have British and American buttons and horseshoes and things like that. This is a replica of a Brown Bess military musket. We have an image of the Cherokees who went to London after the French and Indian War to sign treaties and get peace. And then we have the proclamation from the king saying that, yes, there is peace, but the British would take a certain amount of Cherokee land and da-da-da-da. Now we're moving from the French and Indian War, so the next war that the Cherokee were involved in is the American Revolutionary War. So they were allies with the British again, and that was their mistake because they lost big time early on and had to give up some more of their land. This map shows where the Williamson expedition came in and burned what remaining Cherokee towns there were after the Revolutionary War, where they burned a lot of towns. So there were a few towns remaining here, and they burned those, and then the Cherokee had to sue for peace. Everything we have here has been donated, so everything you have seen in the showcases here has been donated to us. And this is one spectacular thing we have. We have an actual Revolutionary War era sword that was donated by a lady, and she told us the history of the sword. So that's a very valuable thing we have here. The next display we have kind of brings things up to date, and it shows that yes, the Cherokee were here and they are still here. We still have people who have Cherokee ancestry who live in Oconee County. We have an illustration of some families who still live on native land. There was also a Cherokee trade going on here in Oconee County and in Walhalla into the 1940s. There were some really interesting stories about the Cherokee who came through Walhalla in the early days and interacted with the German settlers who were here. And keep in mind that at that time the Cherokees didn't speak English very well, and neither did the German settlers, but somehow they got along and could communicate. I want to point this treaty out to you. This is the treaty that the state of South Carolina and the state of Georgia signed with the Cherokee in 1777. This is actually before we had a United States, so individual states could make treaties. It says a lot of good things about South Carolina and the way we treated the Cherokee. Our state allowed the Cherokees to come back and raise and gather the corn and remove the corn that they had planted before the war started. They were also not forced to leave their lands, and that's contrary to what a lot of people think about the Trail of Tears. Every time we had a treaty in South Carolina, the natives did not have to leave. They could stay here. So we were not involved in the Trail of Tears. We've talked about wars that the Cherokees were in and trade and trading paths and all that. This is an illustration of the trading path from one end of the state to the other. This map was made back in 1730 by the British government. They hired a surveyor to go from the coast on up to where the Cherokees lived here in the upstate. But this trading path had been established for thousands of years before there was white settlement at Charlestown. It just happened that the people who settled Charleston picked this area for their settlement because there was already a trading path there. If you go up the path from the coast, the first Cherokee village you would get to would be Kiowee Town. There were 7 paths that intersected at Kiowee Town, but if you continued on the main path, the next town you would come to would be Oconee. And if you continued upward, going north, you would come to Tomasi and Troy and Chattooga, and then cross the Chattooga River into Georgia and all, and then points west. But a lot of the names we have around here were Cherokee villages here in what is now Oconee County. The idea of the museum and all started right here at this monument. When we were building this monument years ago, we explored the building across the street from the monument. Everything happened according to plan after that. So we started with the little 2-room museum across the street from the Spirit of Oconee Monument, and then we expanded both ways after that. So this is where it all started.